So welcome everybody. My name is Paul Herbert and I'm the museum director, and I know that 98% of you know that and could probably give my welcoming remarks for me, but I'll give them anyway. It's a delight to have you here at Cantigny. Cantigny is the historic estate of Colonel Robert R. McCormick, who owned and published the Tribune for 40 years. And second only to the Tribune in his heart was the 1st Division of the U.S. Army, in which he served in World War I as the commander of the 1st Battalion, 5th Field Artillery. He came home from the war, named this estate Cantigny in honor of the first battle, first American battle of that war, and was devoted to the 1st Division, now the 1st Infantry Division, and veterans and service people forever thereafter. And when he passed away in 1955, he left his country estate here in Wheaton, Illinois as a park to the people of Illinois, or for the people of Illinois. And if you came down from Wisconsin, that's fine. We're just as welcome, or Indiana, Iowa, or anywhere in the great United States. And so we do these programs always on the, or almost always on the first Wednesday of every month on some aspect of the history of the 1st Infantry Division or related history or topics that we think are worthy of the public's attention. Tonight we're delighted to have Lieutenant Colonel Mark Viney join us to talk about his experiences a decade ago in the Balkans, a little more than a decade ago. But before I do that, his lovely wife Michelle is with us here, sitting in the front, and I picked out the most strikingly handsome gentleman in the audience to to seat her next to, and I'm going to join her in just a minute there. And Michelle, we're delighted to have you. Thanks for coming out. Mark is I was going to have Mark here a year ago, and Uncle Sam decided they needed him in Afghanistan more than I needed him out here, and so he's not too recently back from a year's tour in Afghanistan, and along with everything else, Mark, we appreciate that service. Thank you for serving, and we're glad to have you home safely. He is now on the Department of the Army staff and the G1 personnel in the Pentagon. He was, for 2 years, he was the director of the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, which is a major history organization. He is a 4th generation Army officer. Somebody asked me earlier, when did the 1st generation start? I told him 1776. He can correct us later on. He is a 1981 graduate of the United States Military Academy. He has 2 master's degrees from Webster University. He has been an infantry officer, an armor officer, and an adjutant general's officer in his 21-year career, and has served in the United States, Saudi Arabia, Germany, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Afghanistan, and Iraq. He is working on, he has a variety of awards. He's working on a new book on the Joint Chiefs of Staff and strategy in the war in Vietnam. But what brought him here this evening is his first book on his experiences with the 1st Squadron, 4th Cavalry, 1st Infantry Division in Bosnia in 1996. And part of the reason why I invited him here, it's a great book. But the other thing is this is almost forgotten history. You know, how many of us remember the controversy of sending troops into the Balkans in the 1990s? And one of probably the most important strategic goal that I have as the director of the 1st Division Museum is to expand this museum someday in order to continue the story beyond the return of the division from Vietnam in 1970. The Army shifted to the all-volunteer Army and made it work. And the Army helped conclude the Cold War on a victorious note without firing a shot. And we deployed that Army to Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, where it succeeded greatly. And then we sent it to the Balkans for the 1990s. And it kept the peace and stopped the bloodshed in Bosnia and Kosovo. And that same Army we've reconfigured a couple of times, and now we've deployed it Lord knows how many times, not just to Iraq and Afghanistan, but to Somalia and the Horn of Africa, and the Sinai Peninsula and the Korean Peninsula, and Lord knows what else it has done. And that huge swath, 40 or 50 years of history, it's been almost, we're about to start the 50th anniversary of the war in Vietnam. So there's a lot of water that's gone under the bridge and that is not told in our museum. And so one of the things you're going to see us doing more and more from a programmatic point of view is talking about the post-1970 history of the 1st Infantry Division. And the 1st Infantry Division was in Bosnia for the equivalent of about 3 division years off and on, firstly in 1995 and 1996 with the Quarter Cavs deployment there as part of the 1st Armored Division. So I'm not going to take any more of his time or his message, just to say welcome, Mark, and we appreciate your service, and I'm really looking forward to having you tell us about that important time in the 1st Division's history. So welcome to Cantini. Please welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, for that very kind introduction, and thank you for your tremendous hospitality to Michelle and I. You mentioned that we've been trying to schedule this lecture since last spring, and I'm really excited to finally be here. Not just since we've been trying to coordinate this presentation, but since I served in the 1st Infantry Division back in 1996 through 1998. I'm a proud member of the Big Red One, and I share the pride in being associated with this great organization that Colonel Robert McCormick, the founder of the foundation, felt. And this great facility that Michelle and I had the opportunity to tour today really captures the spirit of the Big Red One. And if Colonel McCormick were alive today, I'm sure he'd be absolutely thrilled with the opportunity that the American public has to come and understand the division's history and in the broader context of the American military experience. So thank you again, Paul, and to Kara and your staff. And thank you all for being here tonight. I want to talk to you about a very important chapter in the history of the 1st Infantry Division, one that you may not know so much about. It involves not combat, but a stability operation, as Paul said, that was conducted in Bosnia-Herzegovina back in 1996. Why do we need to talk about stability operations? I mean, the U.S. Army exists to fight and win our nation's wars, right? Well, that's correct. But what does the Army do in between those wars? What not many people realize is that in our nation's history, we have only fought 11 conventional wars. And yet, in between those wars, we've engaged in hundreds of stability operations. So contrary to popular perception, the military history of the United States is one characterized by nearly continuous stability operations, punctuated by very distinct episodes of major combat. The U.S. Army acknowledged that fact in 2008 when it published Field Manual 3-07, Stability Operations. And this manual institutionalizes the lessons of the past, and it charts a way forward. And one of the stability operations that informed this manual was Operation Joint Endeavor, which was conducted in Bosnia. I served there with the 1st Infantry Division, with the famed 1st Squadron, 4th Cavalry, or Quarterhorse, as the squadron is commonly known. And tonight I'd like to share with you some highlights of our year-long tour there. Now, I tell the complete story of Quarterhorse during the period 1995 through 1997 in my book, United States Cavalry Peacekeepers in Bosnia. And the story of our squadron's experience during that period makes a useful case study for the public to understand how tactical units of the modern U.S. Army prepare for, conduct, and then recover from stability operations. 17 years ago this month, 60,000 NATO troops were hurriedly preparing to enter Bosnia-Herzegovina to implement a peace agreement that concluded a bloody, ethnically motivated civil war. Operation Joint Endeavor was the first ever ground operation conducted by NATO and the largest military operation in Europe since World War II. It commenced in December 1995 and was concluded 12 months later. The 900 cavalrymen of Quarterhorse and our attached units were a small but very prominent portion of the international task force in Bosnia. Quarterhorse was one of the first combat units of NATO's implementation force, or I-4, to enter Bosnia in early January '96. We played a pivotal role in the nation, in the international effort to mend that nation, which was still smoldering from 3.5 years of civil war. And despite the mountainous terrain, bad weather, tens of thousands of landmines, the periodic threat of terrorist attack, Quarterhorse upheld the peace in one of the most challenging parts of the American sector. And for its achievements, our squadron was awarded the Army Superior Unit Award. And 5 of our cavalrymen further distinguished themselves through individual acts of gallantry, for which they were awarded the Soldier's Medal, the only American soldiers out of the 20,000-man American contingent in Bosnia to be so honored. And I was privileged to serve with such fine men. The condensed version of their story that I would like to share with you tonight is my own interpretation of historical events and does not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Defense. For over 3 years, dismayed Americans watched horrifying scenes of the Bosnian Civil War on TV. We were the world's sole remaining superpower, so expectations were high for America to do something to end the bloodshed. Our foreign policymakers struggled for an appropriate response since American interests weren't readily apparent in this part of the world. After the peacekeeping debacle in Somalia just 2 years earlier, the United States was reluctant to send troops to yet another forlorn nation. In Somalia, we sent peacekeeping forces to that famine-stricken, anarchist state only to depart in haste after mission creep led to combat operations and the loss of 18 Americans killed and almost 100 wounded. And you're familiar with the Black Hawk Down movie, which captured that. But throughout 1995, reports of the worst war crimes, atrocities in Europe since World War II continued to stream out of Bosnia. The United States had to act. The United Nations had proven itself incapable of stopping the Bosnians from massacring each other. European leadership proved itself powerless to present a unified, determined response. Only American diplomatic leadership and the U.S. military could mobilize NATO to stop the fighting. In late December of 1995, Quarterhorse received orders to deploy to Bosnia as part of a multinational peace enforcement task force. And we would deploy sometime soon after the warring factions concluded a peace agreement, and that was imminent. Quarterhorse, which was based in Schweinfurt, Germany, was the division cavalry squadron of the 1st Infantry Division. It was institutionally geared towards fighting in unfamiliar territory and gathering intelligence. It was comprised of 3 ground cavalry troops and 2 air cavalry troops. And it was organized, equipped, and trained to operate over extended distances to protect our parent division. A headquarters troop and an aviation support troop sustained our ability to fight. Our 3 ground cavalry troops, which were Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie Troop, were each organized with 2 tank platoons, 2 scout platoons, a heavy mortar section, plus 12 various wheeled and tracked support vehicles. The ground cavalry troops were largely self-sufficient and capable of operating over extended distances. Each ground troop was equipped with 13 M3A2 Bradley cavalry fighting vehicles, this vehicle you see up here on the right, 9 M1A1 Abrams main battle tanks, and the various support vehicles, plus 2 M106 heavy mortar carriers. Our 2 air cavalry troops, which were Delta and Echo troops, were equipped each with 8 of the Army's brand new OH-58DI Kiowa Warrior armed scout helicopters. Assuming command of Quarterhorse just 2 months before our deployment was Lieutenant Colonel Anthony W. Harriman, who is a quiet, quirky, unassuming scholar. He had taught English at West Point a few years earlier. And I would note that one of his colleagues in the English department there, a fellow armor officer named Marty Dempsey, you may recognize that name, he's now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But like Dempsey, Harriman was a very tactically proficient cavalry officer, and in Bosnia he would prove himself a very capable arbitrator and negotiator. On 21 November 1995, the presidents of Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia reached an agreement on a comprehensive settlement to the end of the Bosnian Civil War. They were practically held captive at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio near Dayton for 3 weeks. And the agreement they reached was commonly referred to as the Dayton Peace Agreement. The civilian, humanitarian, and political portions of the agreement aimed to bring the three warring factions back together as peaceful partners, not merely as foes who simply stopped fighting each other. The three presidents agreed upon the complete systematic restructuring of Bosnian society. The military portion of the Dayton Agreement involved separating the warring factions and establishing a 600-mile-long demilitarized zone between the two entities of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was a federation of Croats and Muslims, and the Bosnian Serb Republika Srpska. On 1 December 1995, NATO authorized the deployment of 60,000 soldiers to Bosnia to execute the military portions of the Dayton Agreement. This implementation force, or I-4, was commanded by U.S. Navy Admiral Leighton W. Smith, Jr., who was the commander of NATO's Southern Theater. 19 days later, NATO assumed command of the Bosnian peacekeeping mission from the United Nations Protection Force, or UNPROFOR. For service in Operation Joint Endeavor, the Quarterhorse Squadron was detached from the 1st Infantry Division and attached to the 2nd Brigade Combat Team of the 1st Armored Division. Now, that division already had its own division cavalry squadron, the 1st Squadron 1st Cavalry, but senior planners felt that the division would benefit from the capabilities of having 2 cavalry squadrons, since each would provide extra combat power and intelligence gathering capabilities. For the operation, NATO divided Bosnia-Herzegovina into 3 I-4 areas of operation. American Major General William L. Nash, the commander of the 1st Armored Division, commanded Sector North from Tuzla Airfield. Great Britain's 3rd Division operated Sector West with its headquarters in Banja Luka, and the French 6th Division operated in Sector Sarajevo. And all these divisions fell under the control of the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, commanded by British Lieutenant General Sir Michael Walker in Kislyak. So the area that we're going to talk about is MDN, Multinational Division North, American Sector, particularly this area east of Tuzla, right in there. Now, the American I-4 contingent was called Task Force Eagle, and its sector covered 144,000 square miles of territory. Colonel Greg Fontenot, who commanded a tank battalion in the 1st Infantry Division during Operation Desert Storm, was now the brigade commander of the 1st Brigade Combat Team in the northern portion of the American sector. Colonel John R.S. Batiste commanded the 2nd Brigade Combat Team down in the southern portion. And that was a much more rugged area. Our squadron was attached to Colonel Batiste's 2nd Brigade Combat Team in November of 1995. You may recognize that name. If you're familiar with the 1st Infantry Division, you'll recognize him as the division commander in 2004 in Iraq. He was a later commanding general. The American sector also included several Allied units. There was a mixed Nordic brigade from several Scandinavian countries, a Polish battalion, a Turkish brigade, and a Russian airborne brigade. Smaller elements from Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia also served in the American sector. The Scandinavians and Poles occupied the northwest subsector near Doboj. The Turks occupied the southwest near Zenica, while the Russians covered the volatile northeast area near Berchko. And in the summer of 1996, German forces joined us. After 69 days of hectic pre-deployment activities, Quarterhorse departed Schweinfurt on 1 January 1996 aboard buses bound for the intermediate staging base in Tezar, Hungary. From there, our ground elements rumbled south in multiple troop-sized convoys. Bravo Troops' convoy of 77 vehicles was about 2 kilometers long. It took our troops 19 hours to move through Croatia to staging area Harman, which was located near Županja at the bridgehead on the Sava River, which forms the border between Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Task Force Eagle's crossing of the Sava River, you may remember, it generated a lot of publicity. It was the largest American river crossing since World War II. Bad weather and flooding and misrouted bridging equipment delayed the crossing, the completion of the pontoon bridge by several days. So our cavalrymen put that time to good use. The first Quarterhorse element to enter Bosnia crossed the river on 3 January. Colonel Batiste expected all elements of his brigade combat team to move tactically and deliberately and to inspire respect and confidence. Quarterhorse led the way. After conducting a forward passage of lines through the 1st Squadron, 1st Cavalry, we established a buffer zone near Tuzla, and then we fanned out and deliberately occupied and cleared the rest of the 2BCT sector. The route into our sector was narrow, hazardous, and mine-laden, and it stretched nearly 120 miles. The terrain and weather proved every bit as challenging as we had expected. 2 accidents occurred en route, which caused heavy damage to 4 Quarterhorse trucks, although no one was injured. And it took our troops nearly 23 hours to move from the river to Tuzla. During this movement, our air cavalry troops performed valuable service. As the ground elements moved south, the Quarterhorse aerial weapons teams of 2 Kiowa warriors each provided security far to the front and to the flanks and provided us a general idea of the trafficability of the route. We were startled by the scale of destruction that Bosnians had inflicted upon themselves. Entire villages lay in rubble. Houses that were still standing were vacant, gutted, pockmarked by bullets, and spray-painted with ethnic graffiti like you see in the slide. The fields were fallow and covered with minefields and trench lines. Concertina wire replaced humble wooden fences. Everything was broken, blackened, or shot up. And snow, dirty slush, and mud covered everything. Alpha Troops Staff Sergeant Wilfredo Comps told a reporter, "We didn't really understand why the U.S. Army was here until we saw a little girl with a heart with I-4 on it. There were older people crying. They couldn't believe it. Most of the older people threw kisses. It was breathtaking." The remainder of Task Force Eagle followed Quarterhorse into Bosnia during the first 6 weeks of 1996. Now, I believe you all have a copy of this map passed out as a handout. It's not too detailed, but let me try to walk you through it. From Tuzla, our ground cavalry troops split up to occupy the entire 2BCT sector, which comprised an area of 4,300 square kilometers. The Quarterhorse subsector comprised the northernmost part of the brigade sector and extended along the Tuzla Valley. Here's Tuzla. The valley runs basically east-west. Forming the northern border of the valley was a low line of hills called the Majevica. In the south, you had a very tall, heavily forested mountain range, the Konja Range. You have the inter-entity boundary line, which I'll talk about, separating to the west the Federation, the BiH Federation, and then to the east, Republika Srpska. The major population centers in our sector included Banovici in the west, Zivanici, Kalisha, and then Zvornik here in the east. In terms of sheer size and local activity, the Quarterhorse sector was the most challenging portion of the entire American zone. Upon arrival into sector, U.S. forces fanned out and occupied 23 pre-planned base camps or lodgment areas. Our 3 ground cavalry troops occupied a camp just east of Kalisha that Bravo troop named the Dog Pound. And here are some views of that camp. Down here in the lower right, This is a visit we received from First Lady Hillary Clinton, who brought her daughter Chelsea during spring break to visit us. Our squadron headquarters and air cavalry troops occupied Lodgment Area Mali, which was located on the west side of a vast strip mine that we called the Quarry. It lay southwest of Zvinici. This mine covered an 11-kilometer square area and had been very active in previous years, but now the mine was out of operation, whether because of the war or for want of serviceable equipment. On the southeast side of that mine, our squadron trains elements occupied a camp amid towering slag heaps and wide pools of deep, sticky mud. This camp soon became known as the Thunderdome for its post-apocalyptic feel. Commanding 300 Quarterhorse support cavalrymen was Captain, now Colonel, Joe Worrow, who chose the relatively driest spot in a kilometer-sized plain. At the base of the 100-foot slag heap that this photo is taken from, it was the driest spot, but certainly not dry. The clingy brown mud stuck to everything, and it varied from ankle deep to seemingly bottomless. And the rain and occasional thaws contributed to the morass. Now, a staff officer up in the 1st Brigade sector was quoted in the Stars and Stripes magazine about mud, and I thought it was a good quote, and it was something we could really relate to. He said, "There's something about mud that's different from snow or dirt or anything else. It's demoralizing. It saps your soul. It sucks at your will to live. Even if you go to a clean place, it follows you and reminds you how miserable you are." And those of us who lived in the Thunderdome occasionally shared these sentiments, because we lived in the mud for nearly 9 months. And it was only when the summer heat occasionally dried out all but the deepest bogs did we get any break from it. But even then, it all turned to dust, and so we were coated with dust all over everything. During the Bosnian Civil War, the factions fought a war of attrition from trenches and bunkers along battle lines that changed hands several times. And between them were numerous minefields and destroyed villages. The roads running between the opposite lines were blocked by minefields, craters, tank ditches, berms, and bunkers. The inter-entity boundary line, which forms the difference between the shaded portion and the white portion here, was the line that the parties to the Dayton Agreement agreed upon would be the permanent boundary between the Federation and Republika Srpska. And this IEBL went into effect 45 days after the UN transferred authority for the mission to IFOR. Our first priority was to establish freedom of movement across the inter-entity boundary line, not just for IFOR's benefit, but to help the entities restore normal commercial and civilian traffic along main highways. Our initial focus was to clear routes through the 4-kilometer-wide zone of separation that bordered the IEBL. To sustain freedom of movement, once it was established, Quarterhorse, like other I-4 units, manned checkpoints along primary commercial routes to secure and retain control of key intersections, interchanges, and bridges within our sector. One such checkpoint near the village of Caparde was Checkpoint Charlie, so named by our Charlie troop. And this checkpoint helped us to prevent unauthorized shipments of arms in the zone of separation. And it also helped provide freedom of movement for both entities across Route Hawk. Now this picture shows a Quarterhorse convoy on Route Hawk, which ran between Kališa and Zvornik. Now by Bosnian standards, this is a major highway. To us, we saw it as a narrow strip of broken, potholed, narrow pavement. What made it even more treacherous for Quarterhorse convoys was that we constantly had to compete for road space with pedestrians and herds of farm animals, tractors, large trucks, tiny rundown cars, bicycles, and many other I-4 convoys. There were no sidewalks and often no shoulders, so the pedestrians walked right in the lanes of traffic. Soon after arriving in sector, Quarterhorse began daily and nightly reconnaissance patrols along all cleared routes and areas to establish a force presence. The key was visibility. We had to get out there. Significantly, some of these patrols were the very first combined operations between American and Russian forces since World War II. All former warring factions were required to completely vacate and clear a 10-kilometer exclusion zone on both sides of the inter-entity boundary line. And mines, demolitions, and other unexploded ordnance had to be removed from this exclusion zone. The factional forces were required to withdraw out of the field and into pre-registered cantonment areas, such as this one here. By the 10th of February, we succeeded in separating the Federation Army from the Bosnian Serb forces in our sector. The Federation forces moved west of the zone of separation, and the Bosnian Serb forces moved east. Also soon after arriving in sector, Quarterhorse began daily inspections of weapons and equipment storage sites. These are two pictures of Colonel Harriman, our squadron commander. By showing up with sufficient force, we compelled the factions to cede the right of entry, although some later inspections within the 2nd Brigade sector did spark some major incidents. During these inspections, our cavalrymen inventoried all the weapons and ammo present, and they checked for any discrepancies. Whenever any were found, we required the offenders to fix the deficiency before we left. On occasion, we found it necessary to bring in other patrols to press the issue because Bosnians respected force. For the first 3 months of Operation Joint Endeavor, our air cavalry troops flew the same type of missions that they would perform in combat. There was so much terrain to look at that all 16 flight crews, including the 2 troop commanders' crews, flew continuous 24-hour operations. Our air cavalry troops were tasked with helping to locate factional vehicles and forces within the zone of separation. What usually transpired is that an aerial weapons team of 2 Kiowa warriors would locate a factional element that was not where it was supposed to be and would notify our Squadron Tactical Operations Center, which would then vector a ground patrol to go escort the offenders back into an approved area. Most of the time, the warring factions responded impassively to our helicopters. A notable exception occurred in January when an Echo Troop aerial weapons team surveyed a factional brigade headquarters site. Parked outside were 4 M36 tank destroyers and a twin-barreled anti-aircraft gun. When the Bosnian gunners noticed our helicopters hovering about a kilometer away, they raced to bring the gun into action. Of course, our pilots, with their great sights, saw this provocation, and one of them armed a Hellfire missile to launch against it. The Bosnian gunners apparently realized that probably wasn't the most prudent decision they'd made, so they backed down. In February, our air cavalry troops expanded their aerial reconnaissance to cover the entire 10-kilometer exclusion zone on both sides of the inter-entity boundary line. And this area covered a total area of 750 square kilometers. Once an initial reconnaissance was complete, the 2 troops flew periodic follow-up missions excuse me, over selected areas of interest. And what they were looking for was to confirm the absence or return of factional forces. So they paid particular attention to the miles of trench lines and bunkers within the zone of separation. In March, the air cavalry troops expanded their focus once more, and they began flying over the entire 4,300 square kilometer brigade sector. January and February '96 were the most difficult and dangerous months of Quarterhorse's tour in Bosnia. Stress was high because we anticipated hostile fire at any time, and mine strikes were also a constant presence. With so many armored vehicles and aircraft in motion over very rugged terrain in the depths of winter, snow, ice, mud, anxiety, and exhaustion were our constant companions. Experts predicted that it would take years, if not decades, to rebuild Bosnia. The infrastructure was severely crippled from the 3.5-year civil war. Everywhere we ventured, we saw entire villages reduced to rubble. Fields lay fallow and were scarred by trenches and craters. Imagine, if you will, walking down a street and everything that could be broken was. The street lamps were shot out, the road signs were bullet-riddled and bent up, the curbs were crumbled, the roads were potholed like Swiss cheese, buses and cars were gutted and blocked roads, or else they were tumbled down into ditches and streams. The telephone and electric wires hung limply from shattered poles. Large stores such as this one were bombed out and looted. The destruction that the Bosnians inflicted upon themselves was just unimaginable. A pall of brown dust hung in the winter air over Bosnia. The smog was from the low-grade coal that the Bosnians used for heating and cooking. This is a dirty, crumbly brown coal was mined from this strip mine near our lodgement area, Mali, and the Thunderdome. Another of I-4's primary missions was to supervise the clearance of an estimated 6 million landmines and fortifications that the factions had in place during the war. We did not remove these mines ourselves, but we supervised and, where necessary, trained the factions whose responsibility it was. Our initial mine-clearing operations focused on opening roads through the zone of separation to allow freedom of movement for I-4 and civilian traffic. But the snow and mud made the mine removal process very slow and tedious. Our squadron's first serious casualties resulted from mine-related incidents in late January and early February. On January 30th, Sergeant First Class John Iacano, who's shown here in the insert, led a detachment of 4 Bradleys from Bravo Troops' 1st Platoon on a reconnaissance mission to clear a route through the zone of separation. Near the village of Hadzici, in the center of the Zas, Iacano's Bradley ran over an anti-tank mine. The explosion under its right track lifted the 30-ton vehicle up and over to the left several feet. But fortunately, the explosion went outwards instead of up into the crew compartment. The crew was shaken but otherwise uninjured. To the credit of our mechanics, the damaged Bradley was returned to service within 12 hours. A much more serious incident occurred just 2 days later when several Quarterhorse officers returned to the mine strike location to survey the area with a Bosnian Serb colonel and some American engineer officers. First Lieutenant Bob Washburn stepped on an undiscovered anti-personnel mine, which also wounded Bravo Troops Lieutenant Parnell in the legs and Sergeant Iacano in the face. The explosion took off half of Lieutenant Washburn's foot, and it blew him into the air, landing him square on top of an anti-tank mine which had gone unnoticed. Now, this anti-tank mine's fuse had been replaced with an anti-personnel fuse, so it was a very lethal anti-personnel mine. And it didn't blow up when he landed on it, but we weren't quite sure what was going to happen when we pulled him off. So Sergeant Harris, Corporal Gadsden, and Corporal Alcantar all risked their lives to remove the lieutenant from the mine. They did so successfully. They cleared a route through the minefield, and they treated and evacuated him and all the other wounded. And for their gallantry, all 3 were awarded the Soldier's Medal, which is the highest award for valor outside of combat. Now, these 3 NCOs are really no different than the rest of the folks that I had the privilege to work with. They were simply in the wrong place at the right time, and they did what most of us would have done to help our buddies out. Lieutenant Washburn received a Purple Heart and a prosthetic foot and was returned to the United States. Lieutenant Parnell and Sergeant Iacano both received Purple Hearts, but they were returned to duty. Not more than 1 week later, Bravo Troop experienced its 3rd serious incident, which resulted in the award of 2 more Soldiers' Medals to members of Quarterhorse, to including this one on the left, Specialist Kyle Wren. In short, he dove underneath an overturned Humvee in the middle of an ice-covered minefield to save the life of his fellow soldier. He was later my driver when I commanded Bravo Troop when we got back. He was a great soldier from Kentucky. In early April, our air cavalry troops transitioned to flying around weapons storage sites, disputed villages in the zone of separation, and mass grave sites. This change mirrored the tactical situation on the ground, where our operations were now shifting to civil affairs and psychological operations primarily. was around this time in April that Lieutenant Colonel Harriman composed one of his occasional letters to our families in Germany. He wrote, "Spring planting has begun in Mamichi. Mamichi people move around the gutted, roofless houses, turning earth, pruning trees and shrubs, and planting vegetable gardens. Planting potatoes and corn, mostly. Along the Mamichi street that formed the former Serb front line, the bunkers have all but disappeared. The houses, still windowless, still doorless, have clean floors, swept clean of furniture fragments, wadded clothing, Vignac bottles, ammunition boxes, shells, excrement, all those things your soldiers saw when they first arrived. Yesterday, I saw toddlers in Mamichi yards, trying to divert their parents from the cleanup task at hand. And yesterday, lining each side of a walkway leading up to a house, burned and bare, I saw the green leaves that precede coming flowers, not pushing up some forgotten bulb, but planted there with a purposefulness that suggests the house may not have to wait long for a new roof. Your husbands, sons, daughters, mothers, your soldiers are part of spring this year. This year in Mamichi, in towns around it, Mother Earth has an ally, garbed appropriately in green, Quarterhorse." That's a West Point history professor right there. One of the many international organizations that Quarterhorse eventually came to work with on a daily basis was the International Police Task Force, or IPTF, which was mandated under the Dayton Peace Agreement. Its mission was to monitor, assist, and advise local Bosniak and Serb police forces. The IPTF was under strength, it was handicapped by its mandate, and it also lacked sufficient vehicles and radios. It needed the complete cooperation and support of armed I-4 units to achieve its mission of observing faction police. Now, NATO initially did not want to support the IPTF out of fear of mission creep, but over time, we coordinated with the IPTF almost daily and developed a close cooperative relationship with most of the IPTF officers in our sector. In fact, we saved their butts on several occasions. From the beginning of the Bosnian Civil War in April '92, the Muslim-led Federation government successfully portrayed itself as the hapless victim of Serb aggression. It posed as the only entity within the former Yugoslavia that supported the ideals of a multi-ethnic, multicultural society so valued by the West. But since the signing of the Dayton Peace Agreement, several actions and pronouncements contrary to the spirit of Dayton by the BIH leadership dismayed Western diplomats. Colonel Batiste, our brigade commander, had to keep reminding himself that there were no good guys in Bosnia. All of them were equally crafty and not above deception to further their own agendas. On April 25th, a significant incident occurred in our sector that illustrated just how conniving the Federation leadership really was. Nearly 200 Muslim civilians unexpectedly passed through Checkpoint Charlie to visit their old homes in an abandoned village named Mahala in Serb territory. In reality, this march was part of a deliberate effort to resettle Federation refugees in formerly Muslim towns on the Republika Srpska side of the inter-entity boundary line. This was particularly troublesome as it purposefully exploited the Dayton provisions to encroach upon Bosnian Serb territory. Now, when the Muslim marchers got to Mahala, they were met by Bosnian Serb policemen and an angry mob of Serb civilians. The Serbs, who were armed with sticks and rocks, chanted their intent of driving the Muslims out of Republika Srpska. And the Muslims met the Serbs with violence, and some fisticuffs broke out. An elderly Muslim man threw a couple of high-explosive grenades at the Serbs, one of which hit a tree and bounced back and wounded him. And another one detonated right underneath Captain Kerry Brunson's hovering Kiowa Warrior, although it did no damage. The Serbs responded by throwing a couple of stun grenades into the Muslim crowd. Our Charlie troop, in coordination with other Quarterhorse elements, prevented the violence from escalating further. We also provided safe passage for the International Police Task Force to get to the scene to work with the Serb and Muslim police officers to help defuse the situation. After this incident, our civil affairs and psychological operations and counterintelligence teams worked with local leaders to discourage further such events. Checkpoints, patrols, and a solid information campaign contributed to deterrence. But the burden of responsibility for controlling or dispersing crowds rested fully on the shoulders of the local political leaders, the faction police, and to a lesser extent, the International Police Task Force. IFOR, NATO's implementation force, would not act as police. And we expected rightly that when incidents such as this happened, the media would scrutinize our activities very closely, and they did. Quarterhorse contended with two similar incidents to this, one which we called Mahala 1 because there was another one later on in that village. We never quite managed to avoid getting stuck in the middle. But it was a catch-22 situation. If we got in between the clashing factions, we could get our own people hurt, and we wanted to avoid that. You recall that the Clinton administration was very risk-averse and absolutely did not want to get anyone hurt if at all possible. That was priority number one for us, and that trickled down to our level. If we let the factions fight it out, there was a very real possibility that the incident could spiral out of our ability to control, and we obviously wanted to avoid that too. By late spring, Quarterhorse was firmly established in our sector. Many of us took fresh stock of the desolation all around us. Bosnia and Herzegovina had always been a poor, backwards country long before its civil war, but the nearly 3.5 years of fighting and ethnic cleansing effectively destroyed much of the infrastructure. Nearly every Bosnian family subsisted on homegrown food. Instead of tending front lawns, Bosnians tended large gardens. Scrawny chickens scratched about while goats and sheep grazed under the care of little children. Every family seemed to own a milk cow. Bosnian Serb families also kept pigs. That was one way we could tell them apart from the Muslims, who to us looked pretty much the same as the Muslims or the Serbs and Croats. It was common during the summer months to see Bosnians taking their domestic animals for walks, much as Americans walk their dogs through the neighborhoods. You'd see little old gray men in berets and jackets walking their cows on leashes, or taking a herd of goats or filthy sheep down the side, and often these animals crowded into the lanes of traffic. At first, many of us chuckled at the Bosnians and their pets in the middle of the roads, but then we learned the real reason for these walks. In the summer, they grazed their animals on common land so they could save the harvested hay from their own land for the winter months. Made good sense. Very little commerce existed in Bosnia during our tour there. What free enterprise existed consisted mostly of tiny mom-and-pop stands along the road, such as this one. About the size of a small shed, they carried only a few convenience items, maybe an article or two of clothing, and their quantities were severely limited. Trash from the American lodgement areas provided a lifeline for some of Bosnia's poorest people. The unemployed and displaced war refugees regularly waited at trash dumps for American trucks to arrive with refuse. People clamored and bickered over unopened rations, uneaten fruit, cereal, other items to supplement their meager meals. And others looked for wood, cardboard, or other items that could be repaired. Everywhere we looked in Bosnia, just about everything that could be broken was. It was evident that the communist government of Joseph Tito had done much great work building up the national infrastructure after World War II. Bosnia once had good roads and railways and coal mines and electric plants like the one you see in the top there. But by 1996, all had suffered from many years of hard use, neglect, and war. The Bosnian people simply used items until they wouldn't work anymore, and then they cannibalized them for other uses. I don't remember seeing any junkyards in Bosnia. The cars were simply abandoned on the side of roads, and they were eventually pushed down into streams and rivers after they were thoroughly stripped. By the middle of May of 1996, some 10,000 troops were withdrawn from Bosnia with little fanfare. With most of the military provisions of the Dayton Agreement accomplished, the I-4 strength dropped to about 50,000 soldiers. The number remaining included 16,000 Americans, down from a high of 20,000, and 7,000 each from Britain and France, from a high of 11,000 from both of those countries. The International Criminal Tribunal for War Crimes in the former Yugoslavia, or ICTY, was the first such war crimes tribunal convened since the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials at the end of World War II. And it was responsible for bringing to justice those responsible for the worst atrocities committed in Europe since 1945. The ICTY collected evidence and pursued the 56 men indicted for war crimes. Among them were Bosnian Serb political leader Radovan Karadzic and the Bosnian Serb military commander Ratko Mladic. The ICTY emphasized that an enduring peace in Bosnia would not be possible unless some form of justice was delivered. Like the IPTF, the ICTY needed and requested considerable help from I-4. Admiral Smith, the overall NATO commander in Bosnia, initially refused. He's shown here greeting Prince Charles. NATO is not, I repeat, NATO is not going to provide specific security, or in other words, guarantee security for teams investigating these grave sites. Our job is to provide an environment in which they can accomplish their missions. But on the same day that he made that remark, he was overruled by American Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, John H.F. Shattuck, who made a contradictory statement while touring suspected war crimes sites. Once I-4 guaranteed freedom of movement and many of the Dayton Accords military provisions were met, we did in fact provide significant assistance to the ICTY's investigations. During several periods between May and October, the ICTY team searched for evidence of war crimes atrocities within the 2nd Brigade sector. Quarterhorse assisted them by providing site security and ground and aerial quick reaction forces. These investigations were not without incident. On 3 occasions, Bosnian Serb authorities attempted to block ICTY access to an investigation site, and military police and our ground cavalry elements compelled the Serbs to move aside. The foul task of exhuming putrefied corpses was particularly awful over the summer months. On one occasion, Bravo Troops Lieutenant Parnell, the one who was wounded in the legs in the mine strike I mentioned earlier, took an up-close look at the exhumation. The stench of the decomposed bodies was so intense that it permeated his uniform. And immediately upon his return to the dog pound, his soldiers told him, "Sir, you got to burn that uniform." And he did. One of our air cavalry troops' most dramatic aerial reconnaissance missions occurred in May '96. I skipped over. And it was led by Chief Warrant Officer 3 John Roberts, who's the pilot here on the right. East of the city of Lasanica, his pair of Kiowa warriors wove around the lush, heavily forested mountains and over the cultivated valleys. The mountains in this area were dense, heavily wooded, as I said. The Kiowas flew very low, only a couple hundred feet. A particular hilltop, which looked to have been clear-cut, caught the pilot's attention. Mr. Roberts banked his aircraft around for a closer look. They made a slow pass over what appeared to be piles of cut lumber, haphazardly strewn along a line several hundred yards long. Shuddering with the realization of what they were actually looking at, our pilots brought their aircraft to a hover and grimly switched on their integrated video cameras. The debris field wasn't lumber at all, but the sun-bleached bones, clothing, and baggage of a column of 300 to 600 civilians, apparently Muslims, slaughtered in flight from vengeful Bosnian Serbs. This was an important discovery of yet another act of ethnic cleansing that marked the Bosnian Civil War. Now, these are a couple photos taken by one of the pilots. I know they're hard to see, but These light objects you see in the middle here and all of this right here, these are the clothing and bones of the victims. This atrocity site dated back to the Serb campaign to seize the UN safe haven of Srebrenica, which the United Nations Protective Force failed to keep the advancing Serb army out of. The city fell on the 11th of July, 1995. An estimated 40,000 Muslims who were congregated there were then expelled from this pocket. Many of them had come to Srebrenica fleeing Serb attacks elsewhere. UNPROFOR's failure to stop the Serb assault reflected the overall failure of the UN mission in Bosnia, and it led to stronger American diplomatic and military efforts to stop the war. Nearly 25,000 Muslim men, women, children, and elderly were then forcibly transferred from Srebrenica to Tuzla. About 12,000 Muslim men attempted to break out of the Serb noose around Srebrenica, and moving on foot, they attempted to reach Muslim-held territory about 60 miles away. Thousands of them survived, but as of November 1995, between 3,500 and 5,500 remained unaccounted for. The UN reported that a number of them might have been executed and buried in 6 mass graves near Srebrenica. And Mr. Roberts' Cairo warriors discovered the fate of several hundred of those men who didn't even get a burial. The Federation government hoped that the international, the ICTY, War Crimes Tribunal investigation would help resolve the fate of the nearly 24,000 Bosnians who were still missing from the war. Nearly 2.5 million people fled their homes. During our tour in Bosnia, nearly 300,000 civilians remained displaced. Nearly 1/3 of all family dwellings were purposefully destroyed during the war. A newspaper column blasted, a Western newspaper column blasted Western policymakers for their weak-hearted stance on pursuing war criminals. This article read, "It would be tempting to blame the eventual failure of the new Bosnia-Herzegovina on ethnic enmities, but it can also be blamed on the lack of enough international will, beginning with that of the United States, to help create the conditions for the rebirth of the multicultural, multi-ethnic Bosnia that existed during much of its history. The key failure was the refusal to arrest war criminals indicted by the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague. After setting up the tribunal and sending 60,000 troops to Bosnia to help police the Dayton agreements, the Western democracies shied away from allowing them to arrest either Karadzic or War Chief Ratko Mladic for fear of getting someone hurt in the attempt. Without their arrest, the message will be clear. Crimes will go unpunished. Anything goes in the name of nationalism. The United States and the Western democracies are paralyzed by fear." Now, many of us in Quarterhorse question the I-4 policy toward war criminals, and yet recent history weighed heavily with our senior leaders. Vietnam, Lebanon, and most recently was the mission creep that spun out of control in Somalia just 2 years earlier. General John Shalikashvili, shown here in the center with the 4 stars on his hat, was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said, "I still have ringing in my ears what horrible things we did in Somalia by allowing ourselves to be drawn into mission creep. It's a useful lesson that we learned that I'm not about to unlearn." Lieutenant Colonel Harriman explained the I-4 position on war criminals as best he could to us in Quarterhorse. Yes, Radovan Karadzic is a criminal and should go before a judge, but we're doing more important things like building the peace rather than chase him around. Remarkably, Karadzic would not be arrested until 12 years to the day after he was indicted for war crimes. Mladic was not arrested until May 2011. As our purely military tasks tapered off over the spring, Quarterhorse focused more on information operations, civil affairs missions, and support to non-governmental organizations and humanitarian aid organizations. Here is a typical civil affairs mission in which one of our M88 recovery vehicles is helping to recover a Bosnian truck that had run off the road. Our information operations urge the Bosnian people to embrace the peace process and to view IFOR not as the enemy, but as the facilitator of peace. Bosnians from all three ethnic groups were very gullible to the inflammatory, ethnically motivated propaganda generated by their leaders. It was vital, therefore, that our attached psychological operations teams spread the truth so that people can make proper, informed decisions for themselves. Almost every week, our PsyOps team leader showed the Quarterhorse staff officers samples of the printed products that his team was currently distributing, posters, handbills, pamphlets. On one occasion, he showed us a poster that he'd taken into Galicia to test out on some locals. And this poster showed the sweet, innocent faces of 3 young children. And the caption read, "For their sake, peace." And he reported to us that one elderly Muslim woman took one look at it and concluded immediately that the kids were Serbs. And she said, "I'd like to take them home and cut their eyes out." Likewise, the Bosnian Serbs who we showed the poster to thought the kids were Muslim. So the PsyOps team leader said, "Well, I'm going to go take it to some Croatians, see who they think the kids are." But the anger, the destruction, the poverty that we witnessed in Bosnia was in sad contrast to the innocence of the young Bosnian children who struck a chord with many of us. They abounded in the roadways, the ones so clogged with the traffic that I showed you before. They were always in danger of being run over. But they chased after us, they waved at us and shouted for candy. "Hey you, give me bonbon." By late June '96, when the NATO peacekeeping mission in Bosnia was 6 months old, freedom of movement for all displaced persons to return home was still a dream for many. Quarterhorse and other I-4 units increasingly focused our efforts on this issue. The problem we faced, though, was that resentment still ran too high in some areas for people to willingly allow their former enemies to return. And yet, halfway through the planned year-long operation, I-4 had succeeded in keeping the former warring factions from killing each other. While there was little that we could do to erase their deep-seated hatred for one another, our hope was that a mutual desire for peace would eventually overcome the ethnic hatred. The British Major General Sir Michael Jackson echoed this sentiment. And he said, "Look at the Dayton Agreement, a most ambitious agreement indeed. I'm reminded of the time it took the Western Allies and Germany and Japan to become reconciled after the end of the Second World War, arguably 6, 7, 8 years. If we're really expecting the same thing to be done in 6, 7, 8 months, it seems to me that's unrealistic. Reconciliation takes time. If the people wish to act in an ethnic manner, as opposed to a multi-ethnic manner, at the end of the day, that's what they're going to do. And I'm not going to change it with the big stick of possible military action." In another of his letters to Quarterhorse families, Lieutenant Colonel Harriman captured a cross-section of our squadron's diverse activities on a typical day in late July. He wrote, "Today in the town, just across from the dog pound, folk no longer walk around the burnout bus that has blocked the road there since 1992, resting. Sergeant Stevenson's M88 crew cut up the bus and hauled it away. Today, Echo Troop photographed the railway from Zvinici to Zvornik so Hungarian and Italian rail engineers can predict problems they will have when they rebuild the line in August. Bravo Troop went door to day today towards Zvornik, delivering I-4 papers, asking folk about the elections, and clearing possible ambush sites along the way. Today, Alpha Troop began the gunnery training that will lead them to a successful Hungarian gunnery. Delta Troop flew aerial gunnery missions in Glamak near Croatia, ground crews, and the chaplain reloading helicopter rockets between missions. Fox Troop kept them flying. Today, the S4 assigned tent spaces to physicians collecting forensic evidence for the Hague Tribunal. And today, we all help to do the chores, the maintenance, the putting things away, the guards, the details. Today, we worked hard. A sign of the Bosnians' general level of confidence and security was the incredible period of reconstruction over the late summer and early fall. In August, rebuilding of the devastated city of Kalicia and its neighboring villages really took off. Bullet holes were patched over, rubble was pushed into large piles for removal, broken window panes were replaced, the terribly potholed roads were repaved, shot-up road signs were replaced, lines were painted on the roads for the first time ever in some places. The civilian workers and furloughed Muslim soldiers hacked away at 4 years of undergrowth and pollution from the clogged shoulders of the roadways. This is a Bosnian version of a traveling carnival. Somehow, some of the Bosnians found money and time to take their kids out the swings, ride the swings. And yet, just 2 weeks prior to the planned national elections, Quarterhorse was reminded yet again of our sector's potential for violence. In what we later dubbed the Holiday Madness, another major armed disturbance between Muslims and Serbs erupted in the village of Mahala for the second time. Unfortunately, time prevents me from going into any detail on this episode, but as Lieutenant Colonel Harriman praised us afterward, you stopped 3 riots directly, 1 indirectly, you helped General Walker advance the peace, and generally impressed all observers. You did better than either faction expected. Very, very well indeed. At the beginning of September, it was like someone flipped a big switch. The oppressive Bosnian heat, humidity, and dust suddenly turned back to incessant rain, fog, and mud. Sunny days became a rarity, and when they did appear, again, when the sun did appear for short bouts, it had a visibly uplifting effect on our spirits. Just as the weather signaled a change of seasons, so too did a major political event offer hope for a brighter future in Bosnia. On September 14th, the Bosnian people voted in the first free and fair election since the outbreak of the Civil War. Quarterhorse played a major role in making these elections a success. We did not run the polling stations or secure them directly. Rather, we established a secure climate for other election support organizations to do their jobs. Information operations constitute a huge part of this endeavor. Thus, I-4 enabled the Bosnian people to vote without fear of harassment or intimidation. In early October, Quarterhorse refocused on the issue of resettlement of refugees into their pre-war homes. We applied lessons learned from previous incidents to contend with situations that would develop in Mahala, Osmasi, and in the Russian sector villages of Dugi Dio and Usici. Each of these villages in the zone of separation was a stepping stone in the Muslim strategy for the resettlement of refugees in Republika Srpska territory. And the Bosnian Serbs correctly interpreted these initial Muslim resettlement efforts as military incursions into their territory, although the Dayton Agreement did stipulate freedom for the resettlement of refugees into their pre-war homes. Our squadron's operations in support of this resettlement issue was among the most intensive air, ground, political, military actions of our tour. And we recognized that tensions would linger in these contested villages for quite some time, and the resettlement issue was not resolved by the time of our departure from Bosnia in mid-November. Now, Quarterhorse did not transition from our stability task to the task of redeployment until the first week of November. We were the second I-4 unit to enter Bosnia back in January, and we were also the first to occupy the 2nd Brigade Combat Team sector. We were the last 2nd Brigade team to leave. At 12 o'clock on the 3rd of November, 1996, an announcement went out to all Quarterhorse elements that transfer of authority for our sector had gone into effect. It was an anxious moment for many of us, and it was somewhat anticlimactic. Bosnia had been our home and our purpose for nearly a year. We were tired and yet proud, happy to be going home, but anxious that those who were relieving us would not screw up all of our hard work. We felt a profound sense of ownership for our sector and for our portion of the Bosnian peace. Colonel Batiste presided over ceremonies at the Dog Pound and Lodgement Area Mali to mark the transfer of authority from his brigade combat team to the 1st Infantry Division's Task Force 126 Infantry. It was testament to the level of security that we had established that it was now safe for one lightly armed American battalion to take over the entire huge 2nd Brigade sector. Colonel Batiste told us, while peace rests squarely in the hands of the parties to the agreement, we have given them a start, only a start. We have pointed them in the right direction. Our collective efforts are all but a chapter in the book. We stood firmly on the moral high ground and stared the factions down. We accomplished what many said was impossible over a 4,300 square kilometer sector. We occupied this sector in the dead of winter. We separated factions, forced weapons into approved storage sites, and compelled habitual compliance. In all, 2 BCT confiscated 342 illegal weapons and destroyed 195 of them. The brigade monitored the clearance of more than 388 minefields and the destruction of 299 bunkers. In another ceremony, Major General William Nash, here in the middle, shaking hands with the Bosnian Serb senior leader, recalled, over the past year we've had the cessation of hostilities, the breaking up of the armies, but there's still a lot of work for others to do to bring a long-lasting peace. A military force can only give you an absence of war, not peace. Peace will come from political, economic, and social change. Peace cannot be delivered by an outside agent. The soldiers and commanders of Task Force Eagle have been privileged to work so hard to try to bring about peace, but ultimately the responsibility for peace rests on the shoulders of the people and the leaders of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Our squadron's redeployment home to Schweinfurt, Germany did not occur overnight, but rather was a drawn-out process beginning on November 7th, 16 years ago tonight, actually. The last Quarterhorse element returned from Operation Joint Endeavor on the 15th of December. Our squadron was deployed a total of 351 days. Colonel Batiste told Quarterhorse, "Your operations were deliberate, synchronized, rehearsed, and well executed. You young officers and NCOs remember that standard 20 years from now. Have the moral courage to do the harder right than the easier wrong." We do remember, and we've applied what we've learned in Bosnia, in Afghanistan, and Iraq. General George Casey, who served as the Chief of Staff of the Army from 2007 to 2011, previously served as the Senior American Commander in Iraq in 2004 to 2007. Back in 1996, he was a brigadier general with us in Bosnia. This is him second from right. He told me in June of 2009, "I don't think we could have done what we're doing in Iraq and Afghanistan without having done what we did in Bosnia first." On the 10th of August, 1996, Colonel Batiste prophesied to the soldiers of his brigade, "The Lord has a plan for Bosnia, and we have played a small role in that effort. This is a defining moment in all of our lives. We will look back on it with enormous pride." He was absolutely right. In my 21 years as an Army officer, I have served in combat and stability operations in Saudi Arabia, Bosnia, Kuwait, Afghanistan twice, and Iraq. And no operation is closer to my heart than the one we executed in Bosnia. I'm proud of what my fellow cavalrymen accomplished there, and I am delighted to share a portion of our story with you tonight. Lastly, I'd just like to echo my comment at the beginning. I'm extremely proud of my association with the Big Red One. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be with you here tonight. Thank you. That is just, the map you see there is just, did they get the both of them? Okay, they got this one here. Okay. Yes, what you see in this area, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Montenegro, Kosovo, Republika Srpska, Serbia, that all was the former Republic of Yugoslavia. And in '92, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the breaking up of the communist Warsaw Pact, Yugoslavia disintegrated. And Serbia kept the rump of what was left of Yugoslavia. A couple of the provinces broke away, Albania. The Croats within Bosnia wanted to secede. The Bosnian Serbs didn't want to allow that. So you had this tension. Serbia, again, fanned the flames. But yeah, Tito was the communist leader of Yugoslavia, which all these republics you see on the map comprised.
I noticed a town named Alcatraz. Is there any connection with ours?
What was the name of the town, ma'am?
Alcatraz.
Alcatraz. Alcatraz was named by our soldiers. It was a former hotel, and it was on a strategically located intersection. And we would send a platoon out there for 30 days at a time, and our soldiers who were there considered themselves prisoners for peace, which is where Alcatraz comes from, because it was very austere. Just they put wood down on the floor, very little to do. They had a few wait sets. They would bring hot chow out to them twice a day, but had to come up with their own forms of entertainment. So it was very austere, and like I said, they were happy to get out of Alcatraz and go do something else. But our units rotated. Some would do outpost duties, some would go on patrols, some would do training, some would provide guards, around our camps. That's how we kept people occupied, by doing that rotation.
Following the Second Iraq War, they had that time of anarchy that happened after the fighting stopped and control took place, and it appeared that we didn't have that in Bosnia. Could you comment on picking winners and losers and the command structure that you worked under as far as who got what, when, where?
First, to talk about the situation that we got ourselves into in Bosnia. When we got the three presidents to Dayton to sit down, they were ready to stop the fighting. It suited all of their interest to end the war. It had gone on for 3.5 years. Like I talked about, the destruction was just incredible. So it was in their best interest to comply. Now, down at the local level, that wasn't always the case, and we had a few knuckleheads, particularly the Bosnian Serbs, who we had to get tough with to let them allow us to perform our mission. But it never came to blows, and that was quite remarkable. A couple incidents I talk about in my book very readily could have spawned into combat operations. In Iraq in 2003, after the invasion, I was not there then. I got there in 2004. But from what I have read about it, we very thoroughly planned the invasion, but we did not, our senior leadership did not plan what came next. There was, I think, a misperception that the Iraqis would welcome us with open arms as liberators. Well, initially they did, and that lasted a couple weeks. But then we didn't leave. And we made the unfortunate mistake of dismantling the Army, the Ba'ath Party, everyone who was skilled and qualified to run a country. So then it became our problem to manage. And very quickly, resentments began to build at what was looked at as a foreign occupation. You think back to World War II, what did we do with the former members of the Nazi Party? How did we build that country back? But it was two very different situations. And the lesson that I think Colonel Batiste, later General Batiste, would go on to talk about publicly, after he commanded the 1st Infantry Division in Iraq in 2004, he retired. He became very vocal about what he observed in the Pentagon about the lack of planning for the next phase of Iraq. and I've heard him give a presentation. I've seen him on TV, but that was a very bitter experience for him. But his lesson is that we've got to think through our plans. We've got to stick to our doctrine, which is based, like I talked about this FM 307 Stability Operations Manual. It's based on historical experience. Past is prologue. I'm sure you've heard that said. We cannot forget our past. We cannot forget the doctrine that's based on that past as we go into new situations.
Randy, do we currently have any civility programs going on now? And second question, where do you see some of our future involvements might be?
You may recall that in 1996 there was a presidential election. President Clinton was very eager to be reelected. And from the December 95, when he announced that U.S. troops would go into Bosnia, he said they will all be out in a year, which was disingenuous. We were out in a year, but we were replaced. We were replaced by other cell forces and other forces for a period of 9 years. We were actually in Bosnia for 9 years when the NATO mission eventually was terminated in 2004. We eventually got into Kosovo, Macedonia, and we still have about 700 troops in Kosovo today. So we still have a very small presence in the Balkans. As to the second part of your question, if you've heard General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, talk about a strategic pivot that the U.S. military is doing away from the Middle East, in Afghanistan, Iraq, these wars that we've been involved in for several years, a strategic pivot to the Pacific. There is also an increased emphasis in Africa, and the Department of Defense just created a 4-star level command, Africa Command, which is now commanded by General Carter Ham, who I worked for in the 1st Division when he was the Chief of Staff back in 1998. But there's increased emphasis on Africa. We are doing training missions, equipping missions, equipping the militaries there, training them to serve in appropriate roles, respecting human rights, etc. I don't know whether we will go in or do something differently. That the Rwanda crisis, you remember President Clinton purposefully kept troops out of that. I don't know whether we can expect that, but I would just tell you there is an increased emphasis on the issues in Africa and an increased emphasis on the Pacific.
Thank you. Colonel, hi, my name is Lieutenant Colonel retired Bill Starr, and I also was in Bosnia beginning January 3rd, 96, in Sarajevo at Corps Headquarters as SO1 in the 5 section. I have been wanting to ask this question of somebody with boots on the ground for a long time. As you know, the zone of separation separated the Serbs and the Federation, which made up the Croatians and the Muslims. That's like saying, okay, after World War II, you Germans and Jews get together for a while and take, behave yourselves. That's seemed to be a very difficult situation. What was your experience on the ground with the Federation, getting together along with themselves?
I talked about Checkpoint Charlie, which was in the middle of the zone of separation, and it afforded freedom of movement across the zone so that people could go visit their old homes, go visit their neighbors or relatives, whatever. Initially, there was a lot of reluctance to actually cross over. And so we had people congregating there, and they say, well, can't we just wait here? Can you run down and tell my neighbor that I'm here waiting on him? No, that's not actually, we can't actually do that, but it's good over there, you can go. So there was a lot of reluctance. We ended up making sort of a waiting area. But during the national elections, we operated a series of checkpoints along the border there for people to go across and vote in their pre-war homes. And that was very successful. We had, I want to say, about 12,000 voters cross in just our sector. What was significant about that is when we took them through this point, we searched them for weapons, make sure that they weren't going to do anything disruptive. And remarkably, we found maybe a couple pocket knives out of the whole 12,000 people. What's interesting about that is it's indicative of their level of trust in the security that we had helped build, that they felt confident enough to go across unarmed. What I think is interesting about Bosnia since we left is the absence of what you hear about Bosnia. So I am encouraged that the peace that we helped them establish maybe has taken hold, that those children who remember us and all our convoys going down the roads throwing candy at them, and maybe that meant something to them, that it was important for us enough to go there, that maybe they need to hang on to that peace. But the ethnic animosities are still there. They're not going to go away anytime soon, but I'm encouraged. I really am.
Do you know if does the ZA still exist?
I believe it does. I mean, of course, it would all be self-policed now. I mean, there is a boundary, which I imagine they've built up to, make it more of a permanent fixture, so you can see that you're leaving Republika Srpska going into the Federation or vice versa. But I've looked at Google Maps, which uses satellite photos, and I'd love to go back, but I can't. But I've looked at these aerial photos, and you can still see where our bases are, and you can see where the ZOS was. I've not seen any evidence of like a demilitarized zone that's cleared or anything like that. It's somewhat of a formality, I think, at this point.
In terms of fact-checking, I thought your presentation was right on the money.
Thank you so
From
much.
my experience.
Thank you. Thank you. I started this project while we were in Bosnia. I knew it was historical what we were accomplishing there, and I conducted a number of oral history interviews and gathered documents, and so I started work on it immediately, and it took me about 13 years in my part-time to complete it, and then another 3 years to actually find someone to publish it. So it's been a labor of love for me, and I'm just happy to talk to you all about it tonight.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Mark. Okay, a couple of quick announcements before we wrap up here. We've already covered the questions. Don't go far, Mark. Please come back Friday night. It's our annual luminary tribute to our war dead, but also to all veterans. It's a beautiful thing if you've never seen it. And there'll be 2 performances in this room of the play War Letters, which are dramatized readings of actual letters sent home by soldiers at war from the Revolution through the present. This is our next program here. This is off the first Wednesday. This is Tom Ricks, a journalist with the Washington Post. He's written a very critical review of American military generalship from World War II to the present. He'll be here the evening of November 28th to talk not only about that book, but you may recognize his name as the author of the book Fiasco, a critique of the invasion of Iraq, and his book The Gamble, an analysis of the surge into Iraq in 2007. Many of the general officers that he talks about in his book, The Generals, are officers with strong ties to the 1st Infantry Division. He did some of his research here, and that's part of the reason that he's coming. And finally, if you got some spare change in your pocket, this is a free program. Please drop by the desk in the lobby and contribute it in the red, white, and blue mailbox, which we will see goes to the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans in Wheaton. If you're not familiar with that institution, please pick up some of the literature at the veterans table out there. It is a great grassroots nonprofit organization doing a terrific job helping some of our veterans who are having trouble finding a place to live. That's that. Mark, we're a cheap date. We don't have much for you, but I think we have a token of appreciation if you'd come back up here. This is a beautiful and environmentally correct water bottle that you can carry with you to Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, the Pentagon, or wherever else your country needs your services. And it's got our logo on it, and it says 1st Division Museum, and you won't get it confused with anybody else's water bottle because you have the big red one.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you very much.